This is the story of Eutychus, an ordinary young man who became part of an extraordinary miracle. It's a story of a long night, a heavy fall, and a second chance only God could give. Because even in your weakest moments, when everything seems lost, God's power can still bring you back. The night buzzed with the heat of 100 whispering voices. Inside the packed meeting house, every torch flickered under the weight of rising smoke. The wooden beams above groaned softly, almost as if they too struggled to hold up the night's heavy expectancy. At the center of the room stood Paul, his robe dusty from travel, his hands moving in sharp, earnest motions, his voice weaving fire and hope into every word. And near the very top of the house, squeezed into a cracked stone window ledge, trying to balance between the endless talking and the pull of the cool outside air, perched Eutychus. It wasn't the best seat, but it was the only one left. The closer to Paul, the tighter the crowd. The closer to the torches, the hotter the air. The window was freedom. It was a place where a boy could catch a breath of sea breeze and still hear every syllable about this man called Jesus. A man who had conquered death. A man who could change everything. Eutychus shifted, trying to keep himself from sliding further onto the ledge. "Just stay awake," he muttered under his breath, blinking rapidly. The stars outside blurred together like a great spinning wheel. The night air, instead of refreshing him, seemed to lull him deeper into sleep. Inside, Paul's voice rose and fell like the ocean tide, strong but steady. Time dragged. First an hour, then 2, then 3. Still, Paul preached. Still the torches hissed and popped. Still, the city of Troas, far below, slept unaware. And Eutychus fought the weight in his limbs with everything he had. Earlier that day, life had been different. He had spent the morning repairing nets down by the water's edge, wiping salt from his eyes, trading jokes with other boys who talked big about adventures they'd never take. By noon, he had helped his father patch 2 merchant tents battered by a sudden coastal storm. By evening, he was running through winding alleys, sandals slapping the stones, desperate not to miss what everyone was whispering about. Paul is speaking tonight. Paul, the one who talks about Jesus. They say miracles follow him like a shadow. No one had needed to tell Eutychus twice. Even without a seat, even without a guarantee he could hear a word, he would have come. The window wasn't ideal. The cracked stone dug into his side. The draft made his eyes water, but it was close enough. Close enough to hear about hope. Close enough to believe, even for a few hours, that something bigger than the salt-stained marketplace of Troas could be real. Above him, stars turned slow circles. Below him, Paul's voice spun tales of light breaking into darkness, of chains shattered by faith, of a tomb left empty by a risen king. Eutychus felt the words wash over him, felt the stars tilt, felt the window ledge disappear beneath his weight, and then falling through smoke, through torchlight, through shouts, through gasps. The night shattered. The gathering turned into chaos, and everything Eutychus thought he knew about faith, about life, about his own small place in the world was about to be rewritten in the most impossible way. The scream split the night before anyone even realized what had happened. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chairs scraped, torches wobbled. People rushed to the windows, to the stairs, to the courtyard below. All that remained on the window ledge was a patch of dark stone where Eutychus had once balanced, and a rising chorus of horrified cries. On the hard-packed ground 3 stories below, Eutychus lay twisted and still, his arms flung awkwardly, his sandals knocked loose by the fall. The torchlight from above made him look smaller somehow, fragile, broken. Paul pushed through the gathering crowd, his face grim. He knelt beside the boy, pressing 2 fingers to his neck. Nothing. No flutter of life, no rise of breath. Just silence. The kind of silence that makes people hold their breath without meaning to. The kind of silence that sounds louder than any shout. A woman sobbed into her hands. A man muttered prayers under his breath. Someone whispered, "He's gone." Another said, "God, why here? Why now?" Paul didn't answer them. He didn't argue. He didn't panic. He stretched himself out over Eutychus, lowered his forehead to the boy's chest, and prayed. Not with loud words, not with desperate begging, but with a deep, trembling certainty that the same power that had once rolled a stone away from a tomb could reach even into this broken courtyard. Minutes passed. The stars spun. Someone dropped a clay jar nearby, and it shattered like the boy had shattered. Still, Paul didn't move. Still, Paul whispered. Still, Paul believed. And then, a breath. Tiny. Ragged. But real. Eutychus's chest jerked once under Paul's hands. The boy's eyelids fluttered. A low groan escaped his throat. And slowly, impossibly, he opened his eyes. The courtyard exploded into shouting. Not fear this time, not horror, but stunned, overflowing, astonished joy. Paul smiled, a weary, relieved smile, and lifted Eutychus gently in his arms. "Do not be afraid," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He is alive." The people surged forward. Some cried openly. Others fell to their knees. But Eutychus? He just blinked up at the night sky, dazed, confused, and very, very alive. The stars overhead blurred and spun, but this time they didn't pull him down. They watched as a broken boy stood up again by a miracle no one could deny. Across the city of Troas, the bells that usually rang for weddings or wars began to sound. Not because of death, but because of a life given back. Because even in the weakest, most hopeless moment, God's power was greater. The torchlight blurred into halos as Eutychus stumbled to his feet. Paul steadied him with one hand. The crowd surged around them, voices a jumble, half praise, half questions, all wonder. Is it really him? How? How is he breathing? Was he dead? Was he dreaming? Eutychus didn't have any answers. His legs wobbled like saplings in a storm. The world tilted dangerously, then righted itself. A woman pressed a cup of water into his hands. Someone draped a cloak over his shoulders. Another patted his face, as if to make sure he was real and not a ghost. Paul guided him back toward the house, back up the cracked stone stairs, back through the doorway crowded with staring faces. Inside, the room had fallen completely silent. Not a cough, not a shuffle. Even the torches seemed to burn softer, as if they too were holding their breath. Paul turned to them, his voice gentle but strong. "The night is not over." He motioned toward the long table where bread and wine waited. "Come, let's break bread together." There was no hesitation. The people poured back into the house, not because of duty, not because of tradition, but because hope now filled the room thicker than the smoke. They had witnessed something no law, no temple ritual, no Roman guard could explain away. Death had bowed, and life had risen. Eutychus slid into a spot near the back of the room, still clutching the cloak around his shoulders. He could barely make sense of what had happened. One moment, he was falling. The next, he was breathing again. The ledge, the stars, the rush of air, they all felt like a dream now. But the ache in his ribs was real. The stinging scrapes on his palms were real. The weight of Paul's steady gaze was real. As Paul broke the bread, he spoke quietly. We were dead in our sins, and God made us alive through Christ. Each word seemed to press into Eutychus's chest like the slow beat of a new heart. Alive. Alive when he should have been lost. Alive because God's power wasn't finished with him yet. He wasn't just the boy who fell. Not anymore. Somehow he knew this fall was only the beginning. The bread was warm in Eutychus's hands. The cup of wine trembled slightly as he raised it to his lips. He ate and drank with the others, but his mind wasn't in the room anymore. It was still on the ledge, on the fall, on the moment, between falling and breathing again. After the meal, Paul continued speaking, but more softly now. He shared stories about shipwrecks and prisons, miracles and narrow escapes. He spoke of Jesus, how he had been betrayed, beaten, and buried. And yet, how death could not hold him. How the weakest moment became the strongest victory. Eutychus sat there, the flickering torchlight painting strange patterns across his face. The words stirred something deep inside him, something more terrifying than the fall. A question he couldn't escape. Why me? The meeting finally ended as the first bruises of dawn colored the horizon. People embraced, wept, promised to pray for one another. The room slowly emptied out, friends leading friends down the long stairs into the waking city. But Eutychus stayed behind. Paul found him sitting alone by the window, not the ledge this time, but safely against the wall. He pulled up a low stool beside him. You're quiet, Paul said. Still trying to understand, Eutychus admitted. What part? All of it. Eutychus looked at his hands, the ones that had scraped against the stones as he fell, the ones that now pulsed with life. I should be dead, he said. Why am I not? Paul didn't rush to answer. He let the question settle like dust after a stampede. Then he said, Sometimes God allows weakness to show us his strength. You think God wanted me to fall? Eutychus asked. Paul shook his head. I think he wanted you to know you were never beyond his reach. The words hit harder than the stone courtyard ever had, not just saved from death, saved for something. But what? Outside, the city of Troas stirred to life. Market carts creaked. Fishermen shouted to each other from the docks. The world spun on, unaware that one boy's heart had been broken open and that God had planted something new inside. Eutychus stood, shoulders stiff, but stronger than before. He didn't know where the road would lead. He didn't know what it would cost. But one thing was certain, he couldn't go back to who he was before. Not after being caught by grace, not after falling and being raised. The morning after the miracle, Troas looked the same. Fishermen hauled nets to the harbor. Merchants argued over fig prices in the square. Children chased goats through dusty alleys. The city had moved on. But Eutychus? He hadn't. Everything felt louder, sharper, more fragile. Even the sunrise looked different, like a fire spilling over the rooftops instead of just another day's beginning. At home, his mother gasped when he walked through the door. She threw her arms around him so tightly he almost fell over again. I heard you fell, she cried, her fingers checking his arms, his ribs, his face. I heard. I'm fine, he said gently. Better than fine. But how could he explain it? How do you tell someone that you fell 3 stories and woke up feeling like you'd been caught by unseen hands? Later, as he stitched a rip in a merchant's tent, his old job, his old tools, his old routine, Eutychus couldn't shake the feeling. What now? The answer seemed simple. Move on, be grateful, go back to normal. But normal didn't fit anymore. The leather needle felt heavy and clumsy in his fingers. The dusty marketplace smelled too sharp. The arguments of the merchants sounded so small. At the well, an old fisherman slapped him on the back. Heard you survived the fall. Guess you're one of the lucky ones. Guess so, Eutychus answered, forcing a smile. But inside, a war raged. Because deep down, he knew survival wasn't luck. It was a calling. And he hadn't figured out yet if he was brave enough to answer it. That afternoon, Paul's group prepared to leave Troas. Word spread quickly. Small knots of believers gathered at the docks to say goodbye. Eutychus stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart hammering. He could stay, keep mending tents, keep blending into the background, or he could go. Follow the man who had pulled him from death's doorstep. Step into the unknown. Risk falling again. Even if you fall, a voice whispered in his heart, God can catch you. The ship swayed against the tide. Paul boarded first, his robe snapping in the sea breeze. Eutychus tightened the worn leather strap of his satchel across his chest, took one breath, and stepped toward the boat. The ship creaked and groaned under the weight of its passengers as it pulled away from Troas. Eutychus gripped the railing tightly, the sea breeze whipping his cloak around him. Below deck, the cargo shifted. Grain, oil, pottery. Above, gulls circled against a hard gray sky. It wasn't a comfortable journey. The floor tilted with every wave. Salt stung his eyes. The food tasted like damp cloth, but none of that bothered him as much as the storm rising inside him. By the second day at sea, the excitement had worn off. Paul taught and prayed and spoke about Jesus constantly, his words full of fire and life. The others soaked it in eagerly, hanging on every sentence. But Eutychus? He struggled to keep up. He felt like a boy among giants. At night, lying on the splintered deck, he stared up at the stars, the same stars he had seen the night he fell. And the questions came back, heavier than ever. Why me? Why am I alive? What if I fail again? What if I fall in a different way? One night, as the ship rolled over heavy swells, Eutychus sat by himself near the bow. Paul found him there, wrapping a worn cloak tighter against the cold. Couldn't sleep? Paul asked. Eutychus shrugged. Hard to sleep when your heart's louder than the waves? Paul smiled faintly and sat beside him. I know that sound. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the water slap against the hull. Then Paul said, You know, falling doesn't mean you failed. Feels like it, Eutychus muttered. It only means you were trying to stand. The words settled over him like a blanket. Warm, heavy, true. Eutychus breathed deep of the sea air. The fear didn't vanish completely, but for the first time, he understood. The fall wasn't the end of his story. It was the start of a new kind of walk, one where stumbling wasn't the shame. Refusing to rise again was. And somewhere deep inside, he decided he would rise, as many times as it took. When the ship finally docked in Assos, the streets were bursting with noise and color. Spices from Arabia, silks from the East, merchants shouting in languages Eutychus couldn't even guess. Everything about the city felt fast, crowded, alive, and dangerous. Paul gathered the group in a shadowed alley before they split up to preach. "Stay alert," he warned. "The message of Christ is hope to some, but a threat to others." Eutychus nodded, heart pounding. He wasn't sure he was ready. He wasn't even sure what he would say if someone stopped him. They paired off. Eutychus ended up with a man named Silvanus, a weaver with a loud laugh and a deep voice. They made their way through the market, weaving past jewelers and fortune tellers and goat sellers. At first they just watched, listened, waited, until a voice barked at them, "You there! Preachers!" A heavy-set merchant stomped toward them, gold chains clanking around his neck. "You bring your God into my city?" Eutychus froze. His mouth went dry. The man's face twisted with anger. "We have gods enough here. Take your foreign lies and leave." People were gathering now, curious, suspicious, hostile. Silvanus stepped forward, calm as a stone. "We offer no threats, only truth. A truth stronger than stone idols and heavier than gold." The merchant laughed harshly. "Truth? The only truth is that you're fools if you think your dead carpenter can save anyone." Eutychus's heart hammered against his ribs. This was it. The moment to run or stand, and then, without thinking, without planning, he spoke. "I fell 3 stories and should have died." The crowd went still. "But he caught me." He stepped forward, trembling, but loud enough for all to hear. "Jesus of Nazareth raised me back, not just my body, but my heart. I'm not preaching for gold. I'm not preaching for power. I'm preaching because I should be dead, but I'm not." For a heartbeat, the square was so quiet, he could hear the gulls crying over the harbor. Then a boy near the front whispered, "Is it true?" Eutychus nodded. "It's true." The merchant scowled and shoved his way back through the crowd. But others stayed, curious, hopeful, listening. Silvanus grinned at Eutychus. "Looks like you just preached your first sermon." Eutychus smiled weakly. "I didn't plan it." "Neither did the fall," Silvanus said, "but both belong to God." And standing there, the dust of the marketplace swirling around him, Eutychus realized God doesn't just revive bodies. He revives courage. He revives purpose. He revives hearts, even hearts that thought they were too small to matter. The road from Assos twisted like a serpent through rocky hills and thirsty fields. Dust clung to every cloak. Flies buzzed around weary travelers. The sun hammered down without mercy. And still, they walked. At first, Eutychus rode high on the memory of the marketplace, the way the people had listened, the way the Spirit had stirred inside him. He thought he was ready for anything, a fall survivor, a miracle boy. Surely the road ahead would be easy now. It wasn't. 2 days into the journey, the first real whispers started. Some merchants who had overheard Eutychus preaching at the docks spread rumors. Troublemaker, fanatic, bringing curses on the trade routes. Soon innkeepers refused them food. Villagers turned cold shoulders. A few tossed stones as they passed. Nothing big enough to wound, but big enough to sting. That night, camped beside a withered olive tree, Eutychus slumped by the fire. He picked at his food without eating. Paul sat across from him, watching quietly. Finally, Paul spoke. You thought the fall was the hard part. It wasn't a question. It was a mirror. Eutychus nodded. I thought being saved would make everything easy. Paul leaned closer, the fire painting lines across his weathered face. Salvation doesn't erase the battle. It starts a bigger one. Bigger? Eutychus echoed, bitter. Paul smiled, not unkindly. When you belonged to death, death didn't bother fighting you. Now you belong to life, and life is a narrow road. The wind hissed across the stones. Eutychus stared into the fire. The flames bent low, nearly dying, then roared up again, like a heart that refused to quit. So what do I do? Eutychus asked. Paul answered simply. You walk. You preach. You fall again maybe, but you rise every time, not because you're strong, but because he is. The fire snapped. Sparks floated into the dark sky. And slowly, a small, tired smile crept across Eutychus's face. He didn't need to be the strongest. He didn't need to be the bravest. He just needed to be faithful, even broken, even tired, even afraid, faithful. The next town on the road was Mytilene. It shimmered in the distance. White stone walls, bustling harbors, markets overflowing with olive oil and iron goods. To most travelers, it looked like opportunity. To Paul's group, it smelled like trouble. Roman banners snapped in the breeze over the city gates. The local governor had issued a new decree. No public preaching, no gatherings without permission, no new religions. Paul called the group together behind a crumbling wall just before they entered. Listen carefully, he said. The Spirit warns me, danger lies ahead. Eutychus's stomach tightened. Wasn't survival supposed to come with safety? Wasn't revival supposed to come with rewards? Paul looked around at them, one by one. I won't force anyone forward. If you stay behind, no shame falls on you. But if you walk in, you walk knowing the cost. Silence. Only the wind stirred the dust. Finally, Silvanus nodded grimly. Then Lydia, arms crossed, chin high. One by one, they agreed. All eyes turned to Eutychus, the boy who had fallen, the boy who had risen, the boy who now had to choose. Will you be a miracle for one night or a living witness for a lifetime? He thought about the fall, the terror of the wind, the weightlessness, the crash, the death he should have tasted but didn't. He thought about the crowd that gathered when he spoke, about the wide, wondering eyes of the boy in the marketplace, about the old woman who touched her heart and wept when he said, Jesus caught me. His voice was small when it came out, but steady. I'm going. Paul smiled. Not wide, not loud. A simple, deep smile, like a master craftsman recognizing a new apprentice. They entered Mytilene under the setting sun, faces hard, spines straight, hearts willing. No armor, no armies, only the fragile, blazing truth of men and women who had met the living Christ and could never walk the same way again. And as they passed under the shadow of the great Roman banners, Eutychus whispered under his breath, even if I fall again, you will catch me. And he believed it. The sun sank low over the white walls of Mytilene, washing the city in deep gold and purple. Shadows stretched long across the streets. The wind carried the smells of roasted barley, seaweed, and fish stew. It should have been a peaceful evening, but tension ran like an invisible wire through the air. Paul and his companions set up in a dusty courtyard just off the main road near an abandoned olive press. The stones were cracked and overgrown, but it was open ground, room enough to speak, to gather, to be seen. Maybe too much room. At first only a few came. An old woman leaning heavily on a carved cane, a merchant boy with curious eyes, 2 sailors still reeking of wine. Paul spoke simply. He told of Jesus, not a general's son, not a Roman citizen, a carpenter, crucified, risen, alive. The words floated across the courtyard like embers caught in the breeze. Some faces lit with wonder, others tightened with suspicion. A few turned away altogether. Eutychus watched from the side, not hiding, not afraid exactly, but feeling small. What could he say that Paul hadn't already said better? What could a boy who fell offer to these sharp-eyed, hard-handed people? Movement caught his eye. Across the street, near a pottery stall, 2 Roman guards leaned casually against a column, not intervening, not interrupting, just watching, listening, waiting. Paul kept speaking, undeterred, unshaken. But Eutychus's palms began to sweat. He remembered the whispers they had heard, no preaching without permission, no gatherings of strange religions. He remembered the fines, the beatings, the prisons. Would it happen tonight? Would the fall that almost ended his life be replaced by a fall into Roman chains? Suddenly, a voice from the crowd broke the night air. "Lies!" a fisherman shouted, his face twisted with rage. "Lies and blasphemy! There's only one Lord, Caesar!" A ripple of tension snapped through the crowd. Some backed away, others edged closer. The 2 Roman guards straightened, hands near their weapons, watching, waiting for one wrong move. Paul stepped forward calmly, opening his mouth to answer. But before he could speak, Eutychus moved. He didn't plan it. He didn't think it through. His feet just carried him out of the shadows into the center of the courtyard, where all eyes locked onto him. He raised both hands high, not in anger, not in challenge, in surrender, but not to Rome, to Jesus. "You call it blasphemy," Eutychus said, his voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "But you don't know what it's like to fall with no hope. You don't know what it's like to wake up when you should be dead." "I do." The crowd hushed. Even the guards tilted their heads, curious. "I fell 3 stories. I broke against the earth. And I woke up breathing. Not because I'm strong, not because I'm lucky, because Jesus is real." His voice cracked but didn't falter. "You can chain us. You can beat us. You can ban us. But you can't undo what he already did." For a long, heavy moment, no one moved. No one spoke. Even the torches seemed to burn a little quieter. Then the fisherman who had shouted slunk back into the crowd. The Roman guards exchanged glances, but turned away. Not tonight. Not yet. Slowly, one woman stepped forward. Then another, a boy with a crooked smile, an old man leaning on a twisted staff. Not a stampede, not a riot. Just a quiet crumbling of the wall between fear and faith. Paul placed a hand on Eutychus's shoulder as he returned to the side. No words were spoken between them. None needed to be. The boy who had fallen was learning to stand, and in doing so, he was teaching others how to rise too. That night, under a sky littered with stars, Eutychus prayed not for safety, not for escape, but for courage to fall forward into faith every single day. The next morning, mist clung low to the ground like a heavy blanket. The group moved quietly through the outskirts of Mytilene, preparing to leave. Eutychus helped roll up sleeping mats and tie supplies onto pack mules. Everything felt different after the night before, braver, heavier, both at once. Paul gathered them near the crumbling well just outside the city walls. The plan was simple. Take the coast road north to the next port, then sail toward Miletus. Simple. But when Paul counted heads, he frowned. 2 were missing. Silvanus jogged up, breathless. "I saw them," he said grimly, heading toward the governor's quarters. Paul said nothing, only tightened the strap of his satchel. Eutychus's gut twisted. "They wouldn't," he started. But Paul's calm gaze silenced him. Not angry, not surprised, only sad. By midday, the rumors confirmed it. The 2 missing men, brothers by blood and faith, had gone to the authorities, told them about Paul, told them about the preaching, told them about the miracles, sold the truth for a promise of favor and silver coins. The betrayal hit harder than any stone from a crowd, harder even than the ground Eutychus had smashed against that night he fell. That evening, they camped by a grove of olive trees. The sun sank blood red over the sea. The smell of salt and wood smoke filled the air. Eutychus sat apart from the others, arms wrapped around his knees. Boiling. Silvanus stomped past, muttering under his breath. "We should have seen it. We should have known they weren't ready." Another man cursed low under his breath. Bitterness rippled through the camp. Paul approached Eutychus quietly, lowered himself to the rocky ground with a soft grunt. For a long while, neither spoke. The fire crackled between them. Finally, Eutychus spat out, "How can you just sit there?" Paul smiled sadly. "What would you have me do?" "Be angry," Eutychus snapped. "Fight back. Tell them they're traitors." His voice cracked, raw, ashamed, exposed. Paul poked the fire thoughtfully with a stick. Sparks floated into the dark. "When I was Saul," he said slowly, "I hunted believers, dragged them out of homes, bound them, beat them, laughed when they died." Eutychus stared at him. Had he ever heard Paul say it so plainly? Paul's voice grew softer. "And yet, Jesus caught me too. Not with a sword, not with thunder, but with mercy." The words sat heavy in the space between them. "If he forgave me," Paul said, "how can I withhold forgiveness from others?" Eutychus dropped his gaze to the dirt. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. But deep down, he knew. Revival wasn't just for the fallen. It was for the betrayers, too. Even when they didn't deserve it. Especially then. "Forgiving them doesn't mean trusting them," Paul added, reading Eutychus's face. "It means refusing to let bitterness chain you to the past." That night, long after the others slept, Eutychus sat by the dying fire. He whispered their names. The brothers who had sold them out spoke them out loud, not with hatred, but with something closer to mourning. And then, finally, with prayer. Not for revenge, not for justice, but for mercy. The same mercy that had pulled him from the edge of death. Above him, the stars gleamed cold and clear. The same stars he had fallen under. But they no longer mocked him. They called him upward. They called him forward. The sun rose red and slow over the distant hills. Another day. Another choice. The road to Miletus was harder than any they had walked so far, not because of distance, not because of hunger, because of the weight in their hearts. Word traveled ahead of them like wildfire. Preachers, disturbers of peace, troublemakers. Some villages barred their gates, others shouted curses from the rooftops as they passed. A few simply watched silently, pitying them like fools marching to their own ruin. And still, they walked. Eutychus felt every stone underfoot, every blister, every sneer, but inside him something new had started to burn, a fire that the fall hadn't extinguished, a fire no betrayal could smother. By the third day they reached a dusty crossroads where traders from Asia met the southern caravans. A wide circle of beaten earth marked the marketplace. Vendors shouted. Camels groaned. Children darted between stalls. It should have been just another stop, but Paul stopped them short. "God is stirring," he said quietly. His eyes scanned the crowd. "Be ready." At first, Eutychus didn't see anything unusual, just the normal buzz of trade, until a woman in tattered blue robes stumbled toward them, dragging a lame foot behind her. Her voice cracked like a dry branch. "Please, someone help, please." The crowd parted coldly, pulling away from her. Some laughed, some muttered curses, some turned their faces. Eutychus's heart twisted. He started forward, but a merchant seized the woman's arm roughly. "Beggar!" he snarled. "You're cursed! Get away!" She cried out, sagging under his grip. The merchant shoved her, sending her crashing hard into the dust. Without thinking, Eutychus broke into a run. He pushed through the crowd, fell to his knees beside her, took her shaking hand in his. The merchant loomed over them, sneering. "You'll catch her disease too, boy." Eutychus looked up. Not with fear, with something fiercer, brighter. "She's not cursed," he said, voice steady. "She's loved." The merchant scoffed, spat at the ground, walked away. Slowly, Eutychus helped the woman sit up, her face streaked with dust and tears, her body trembling. But her eyes, when they met his, were full of raw, desperate hope. Paul and the others gathered around. They didn't pray loudly. They didn't draw a crowd. They simply knelt in the dirt, surrounded by the sneers of men who thought themselves clean. Paul laid his hands gently on the woman's shoulder. Eutychus felt his own hand resting over hers, clumsy but certain. Together they prayed, softly, boldly. And as they prayed, something shifted, not lightning from the sky, not flames or thunder, just the woman's broken body growing still, her twisted foot easing against the earth, her shallow breath deepening. When she stood up moments later, the marketplace froze. Eyes widened. Jaws dropped. Even the merchant who had shoved her stumbled back, crossing himself against what he didn't understand. The woman swayed on her feet, then laughed. A high, cracked, beautiful laugh like a bird remembering it had wings. She hugged Eutychus fiercely. "God has not forgotten me," she whispered. "God caught you too," Eutychus whispered back. They left the marketplace not with coins or riches, but with something far better. Proof that revival wasn't just for the fallen. It was for the forgotten, for the crushed, for the ones trampled by the world. As they walked out of the city gates, Silvanus chuckled low. "You fell once, Eutychus, and now you're catching others." Eutychus smiled, the weight of it all lifting from his shoulders. "It's not me catching them," he said. "It's him." Above them, the sky burned bright with afternoon light. Ahead of them, the road stretched on, harder, longer, but glorious, because Eutychus no longer feared falling. He knew the hands that caught him once would catch him again and again and again. The road to Miletus grew harder the closer they came. Not because the stones were rougher, not because their sandals wore thin, because the rumors ran faster than their feet. At every town, whispers followed them like wolves in the dark. The governor's angry. Soldiers are searching. They won't let the preachers leave this time. By the time they reached the coastal cliffs overlooking Miletus, the sea spread before them like a sheet of hammered silver. Their ship waited far below, but between them and the safety of open water stood a Roman patrol, 6 men. Armor gleaming, swords at their sides. The group froze. Options raced silently through their minds. Fight? Run? Hide? Pray? Paul stepped forward, his face unreadable. Eutychus's heart slammed against his ribs. This was it. Another fall. But this time, would anyone catch them? The Roman captain barked an order. His men spread out, hands on sword hilts. Paul raised his arms, palms open, peaceful, defenseless. Eutychus felt his muscles lock. Everything inside him screamed to flee, to disappear into the rocky hills, to save himself. But then, a memory. Falling, crashing, being lifted by hands stronger than death. He couldn't run. Not now. Not after being revived for a reason. He stepped forward too, right beside Paul. The captain narrowed his eyes, took a step closer. The world seemed to narrow to the space between them, breathless, brutal. Then, without warning, the captain barked another order, "Lower your weapons!" The soldiers hesitated, confused, but obeyed. The captain spat into the dust. "You're fools," he growled, "but you're not criminals." He pointed toward the harbor. "Get out of my city." Paul inclined his head once, solemnly. The group moved quickly, leading the mules down the twisting coastal path. Not running, not hiding, walking. Walking under the watchful eyes of the empire. Eutychus kept glancing back until the cliffs swallowed the soldiers from view. Even then, he felt the tension thrumming under his skin. That night, on the ship rocking gently against the waves, Eutychus couldn't sleep. He sat alone on the deck, legs dangling over the side. The stars above blurred and shimmered. The sea below whispered secrets he couldn't quite understand. Paul found him there, silent as ever, settling beside him without a word. Finally, Eutychus spoke. "I thought faith would feel easier after the miracle." Paul smiled faintly. "Faith isn't about easier. It's about forward." They sat side by side, the salty air tangling their cloaks. "Were you afraid today?" Eutychus asked. Paul chuckled low. "Terrified." Eutychus blinked. "But you looked so calm." Paul turned to him, eyes glinting with the light of stars and something even stronger. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," he said. "It's trusting God enough to move forward anyway." The ship groaned softly against the waves. Eutychus leaned back, staring up at the endless sky. He wasn't fearless, He wasn't flawless. He wasn't finished, but he was alive, and he was walking forward. And for the first time, he realized that was the real miracle all along. The ship cut across the silver waters like a blade. Ahead, the coast of Judea loomed dark and wild against the horizon. The journey was nearly over. But for Eutychus, something deeper had just begun. He stood at the bow, arms braced against the salt-stained rail. The wind tangled his hair, the stars blurred above him, and inside him, not fear, not pride, peace. Not because the road ahead would be easy. Paul would face chains. The others would face hardship. Some would never see home again. But Eutychus knew something now that he hadn't understood that night he tumbled from the window. Life isn't about avoiding falls. It's about trusting the hands that catch you and learning to rise again and again. As the ship pulled into port, Paul gathered them one last time on the deck. No ceremony, no long speeches, only words carved deep with love. "I commend you to God," he said, "and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up. Finish your race. Stand when it's hard. Shine when it's dark. And when you fall, and you will, rise again." Eutychus felt the words etch themselves into his bones. They disembarked in twos and threes, some to stay, some to journey elsewhere, some to risk their lives for the gospel before the sun set again. Eutychus lingered. He stood at the edge of the bustling dock, watched Paul disappear into the winding streets of the city, watched the other believers scatter like seeds on the wind. He could have stayed. He could have built a small life in the background, safe, silent. Instead, he shouldered his satchel, took a deep breath, and stepped forward. The marketplace roared around him. Sellers hawked dates and figs. Soldiers barked orders. Children darted between carts. It would be easy to blend in, easy to lose himself in the noise, but Eutychus didn't choose the easy way anymore. At a busy street corner, he paused. A small group gathered near a fountain arguing about gods and laws and powers. Eutychus smiled to himself. He stepped up, raised his voice above the noise, and told them the simplest, truest story he had. "I once fell from a high place. I should have died, but Jesus caught me." Heads turned, eyes widened, the crowd quieted. "He didn't just catch my body," Eutychus said. "He caught my heart, and he can catch yours too." Some sneered, some shrugged, but some leaned in. Some listened. Some began to hope. And Eutychus knew every fall, every scar, every broken moment, it had all been for this. To show that God's power doesn't just save the perfect, it revives the broken, the weak, the fallen, and through them shines brighter than ever. As the sun burned gold across the rooftops, Eutychus laughed aloud. Not because life was safe, not because life was easy, because he was alive, truly alive. Walking forward step by step into the wild, beautiful life God had saved him for. By step into the wild, beautiful life God had saved him for.